Grayson Hollow, a quaint town nestled between the rolling hills of northern Georgia, stirred awake under a pale October sky on the morning of October 15, 2025. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves, a faint smokiness from distant chimneys blending with the earthy dampness of the ground. At the edge of town, where Main Street faded into a narrow lane lined with sycamores, 75-year-old Eleanor Hayes began her daily ritual. Her silver hair, streaked with the weight of years, was pulled into a tight bun, a habit forged during her service as an army nurse in Vietnam. She wore a simple gray sweater over pressed slacks, her movements deliberate despite the arthritis that gnawed at her knees. In her modest bungalow, a faded uniform jacket hung in the closet, its chest adorned with medals, a Purple Heart for the shrapnel she took in '68, a Bronze Star for saving a soldier under fire, and a commendation for bravery during a night ambush. Eleanor didn't wear the jacket often, but its presence was a quiet reminder of her past. Every morning at 6:45, she walked her golden retriever, Max, along the quiet streets of Grayson Hollow. Her wooden cane, carved with her initials EH by a fellow soldier during the war, tapped a steady rhythm against the pavement. The cane was more than a support, it was a relic of camaraderie, a gift from Sergeant Daniels who hadn't made it home. The town was still at this hour, save for the occasional chirp of a sparrow or the distant hum of a delivery truck. Eleanor savored the solitude, her thoughts drifting to memories of triage tents, the smell of antiseptic, and the weight of a soldier's hand in hers as he whispered thanks. Max trotted beside her, his golden fur catching the early light, his tail wagging with the simple joy of routine. The peace shattered with a sound that tore through the morning like a blade, a low, guttural roar of motorcycle engines. 5 bikers thundered into town, their Harley-Davidsons gleaming under the rising sun, chrome reflecting the golden hues of dawn. They wore black leather jackets, patched with skulls and flames, their faces obscured by helmets until they slowed near Eleanor. The leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a scarred face, removed his helmet, revealing a cruel grin. His jacket bore the name, Razor, stitched in red thread, a fitting moniker for his sharp demeanor. The others followed suit, their laughter rough and unrestrained, echoing off the brick storefronts of Main Street. Eleanor paused, Max tugging at his leash, as the bikers spotted her, their engines idling with a menacing growl. Razor pointed, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Look at this, boys, an old war relic." The others joined in, their taunts a chorus of disrespect. "What's a grandma doing out here, huh?" "Playing soldier," another called, revving his engine. Eleanor's heart pounded, a familiar surge of adrenaline from her days under mortar fire. She straightened, gripping her cane with both hands, her gray eyes narrowing with defiance. The bikers circled closer, their shadows swallowing her small frame, but she stood firm, a statue of resilience amid the chaos. Townsfolk peeked from behind curtains, their fear palpable in the stillness. Razor leaned from his bike, his grin widening, and spat near her feet, the act a deliberate insult. The morning air grew heavy with tension, Eleanor's past clashing with the bikers' present, a silent battle already unfolding on the streets of Grayson Hollow. Eleanor Hayes stood her ground on the quiet street of Grayson Hollow, her gray eyes locked onto Razor, the biker leader whose scarred face twisted with amusement. The morning sun cast long shadows from the sycamores lining the lane, their golden leaves trembling in the faint breeze. Max, her golden retriever, growled low, his hackles rising as the 5 bikers encircled them, their Harley engines rumbling like a storm on the horizon. The air carried the acrid scent of exhaust, mingling with the damp earthiness of the autumn ground, a stark contrast to the peaceful morning Eleanor had begun just moments ago. Her hands tightened around her cane, the wood smooth under her fingers, its carved initials EH, a tactile reminder of her past, a past these men now mocked with their cruel laughter. Razor dismounted, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. He towered over Eleanor, his leather jacket creaking as he moved, the skull patch on his chest gleaming ominously in the sunlight. "Bet you think those medals make you tough, huh?" he sneered, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver down Max's spine. Before Eleanor could respond, Razor snatched the cane from her grip with a swift, violent motion. She stumbled forward, her balance faltering on her arthritic knees, but she caught herself against Max, who barked sharply, his protective instincts flaring. The bikers erupted in laughter, their voices a cacophony of disdain, as Razor held the cane aloft like a trophy. Then, with a deliberate sneer, he snapped it over his knee, the crack echoing through the still morning like a gunshot. Splinters flew, and the broken pieces fell to the ground. A desecration of a sacred memory. Eleanor's breath caught, her chest tightening with a mix of rage and grief. That cane had been a gift from Sergeant Daniels, a comrade who'd carved it during a rare night of peace in Vietnam, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. He hadn't survived the war, but the cane had, until now. Razor tossed the fragments aside, spitting on the ground near Eleanor's feet. "Old hag's got nothing now," he yelled, mounting his bike with a swagger. The others joined in, their taunts growing bolder. "Vietnam? That was a joke war," one shouted, a lanky biker with a snake tattoo curling around his neck. Another, a wiry man with a goatee, mimicked a salute, his laughter sharp and mocking. Eleanor's hands trembled, not from fear but from the storm of anger brewing inside her. She remembered nights in triage tents, the stench of blood and antiseptic, the weight of a dying soldier's hand in hers. She'd faced worse than these men, but the insult to her service, to Danielle's memory, cut deeper than any wound. The townsfolk remained hidden, their silence a heavy weight on her shoulders. Curtains twitched, but no one emerged, their fear of the bikers outweighing their sense of justice. Eleanor straightened, her gray eyes blazing with a fire that had carried her through war. She met Razor's gaze without flinching, her small frame radiating a quiet strength that momentarily silenced the biker's laughter. Max tugged at his leash, urging her toward home, and she turned, her steps slow but steady, refusing to run. The bikers peeled off, their engines roaring as they sped down Main Street, their laughter fading into the distance. But the threat lingered, a dark promise of their return. Back in her modest bungalow, Eleanor locked the door, her hands shaking as she sank into a worn armchair. The broken cane lay on the kitchen table, its splintered ends wound to her pride. She reached for the phone, her fingers steadying as she dialed her son, Captain James Hayes, stationed at Fort Bragg, 2 hours away. James, a decorated officer in the U.S. Army, had inherited her steel. Her voice was calm but firm as she recounted the incident. The taunts, the cane's destruction, the spit on the ground. "They need to learn, James," she said, her tone unwavering. "I can handle myself, but this can't stand." James's voice, deep and assured, promised swift action. "I'm on my way, Mom. Stay safe." She hung up, her mind drifting to Vietnam. Nights of blood and courage, a reminder of what she'd survived. The bikers would return, but now help was coming. Eleanor Hayes sat in her modest bungalow in Grayson Hollow, the broken pieces of her cane resting on the kitchen table like a fallen soldier. The morning's confrontation with the bikers replayed in her mind, each taunt and the sharp crack of the cane's destruction echoing like a distant mortar blast. She moved to the living room, her steps slow without the cane's support, and sank into a faded armchair by the window. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the hardwood floor, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. Max, her golden retriever, lay at her feet, his ears perked, sensing the tension that hung heavy in the air. Eleanor's hands, though trembling earlier, were now steady as she reached for a small wooden box on the side table. Inside were her medals, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, a commendation for bravery, each one a story of survival, of courage under fire. She polished them with a soft cloth, the ritual a tether to her younger self, a nurse who'd stitched wounds while bombs fell, who'd held dying soldiers and whispered comfort in their final moments. Outside, Grayson Hollow was no longer quiet. The bikers hadn't left town. Their presence lingered like a dark cloud rolling over the hills. Reports trickled in through neighbors' calls. They'd harassed Mr. Jenkins at the grocery store, knocking over a display of apples and laughing as he scrambled to pick them up. They'd revved their engines outside the diner, sending Mrs. Carter's toddler into tears, and spray-painted a crude skull on the library wall. Razor, the leader, strutted through town with a swagger, his scarred face a badge of trouble, his crew following like a pack of wolves. Eleanor knew they'd come back for her. She'd seen their kind before, not in leather jackets, but in the faces of enemies across a jungle battlefield. They thrived on fear, on dominance, and her defiance that morning had been a challenge they couldn't ignore. She brewed a pot of chamomile tea, the aroma filling the small kitchen with a fleeting sense of calm. Pouring a cup, she returned to the window, her gaze fixed on the street. The townsfolk avoided her eyes when she'd passed earlier, their fear a barrier she understood but resented. Grayson Hollow wasn't used to conflict. It was a place of bake sales and church picnics, not biker gangs and broken canes. But Eleanor was no stranger to conflict. She'd survived ambushes, nursed soldiers through malaria, and once dragged a wounded private to safety under gunfire. The biker's return was inevitable, a fact that settled in her bones like the ache of an old wound. She sipped her tea, the warmth grounding her, and thought of her son, James. Captain James Hayes, stationed at Fort Bragg, was her rock, a soldier like her but with the fire of youth still burning in him. His promise echoed in her mind. "I'm on my way, Mom." She trusted him just as she'd trusted her unit in Vietnam. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town. The air grew colder, the sky streaked with hues of orange and purple. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the cane's giver, Sergeant Daniels, a quiet man with a knack for carving. He'd handed it to her one night in Da Nang, the air thick with humidity, his smile shy but warm. "For when you're an old lady," he teased. He died 2 weeks later in a mortar attack. The memory stung, but it also fueled her resolve. She wouldn't let Razor's act go unanswered. A distant rumble broke the silence, not the high-pitched whine of Harley engines, but a low, authoritative growl. Military vehicles. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a soldier's instinct kicking in. She stepped onto the porch, Max at her side, and watched as 2 Humvees rolled into view, their green hulls glinting under the streetlights. James had arrived, and with him, the promise of justice. The horizon darkened, but for Eleanor, the light of retribution was just beginning to dawn. The 2 Humvees rolled into Grayson Hollow with the precision that spoke of military discipline, their engines cutting off with a final, authoritative huff that reverberated through the quiet town. The vehicles parked along Main Street, their green hulls glinting under the sodium glow of the streetlights, their presence a stark contrast to the autumnal calm that had defined the day. Eleanor Hayes stood on her porch, her hands gripping the railing, her golden retriever Max at her side, his tail still but his ears alert. The sight of the Humvees stirred something deep in her, a mix of pride and anticipation, the same feeling she'd had in Vietnam when reinforcements arrived after a long night of holding a perimeter. Captain James Hayes stepped out of the lead Humvee, his uniform crisp, the medals on his chest catching the light, Silver Star, Army Commendation Medal, a testament to his own valor in Afghanistan. At 42, he carried his mother's steel, his broad shoulders tense with purpose, his dark eyes scanning the street with a soldier's vigilance. 2 soldiers flanked him, their rifles slung but ready, their faces stern under their helmets, their movements synchronized as they exited the second Humvee. Eleanor watched her son approach, his boots crunching against the gravel path leading to her bungalow. James towered over her, his jaw tight, his expression a mix of concern and barely contained anger. She recounted the morning's events in a steady voice, the biker's taunts, Razor's cruel grin as he snapped her cane, the spit on the ground, the townsfolk's fearful silence. Her gray eyes betrayed the hurt beneath her composure, the loss of the cane a wound to her pride as much as her past. "It wasn't just a cane, James," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "It was from Daniels. He didn't make it home." James's gaze darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. He turned, his eyes locking onto the bikers gathered near the diner, their leather jackets a dark stain against the pastel storefronts of Main Street. Razor, still astride his Harley, narrowed his eyes, his scarred face hardening as he registered the military presence. His crew tightened around him, their laughter dying, replaced by a wary tension that rippled through the group like a wave. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, their curiosity overcoming their earlier fear. Curtains parted, doors creaked open, and a small crowd gathered at the edge of the square, whispering among themselves. Old Mr. Jenkins from the grocery store stood with his arms crossed, his apron still dusted with flour. Mrs. Carter, the young mother from the diner, clutched her toddler's hand, her face pale but hopeful. The air thickened with anticipation, the hum of the Humvee's engines still lingering in the background, a reminder of the power James brought with him. Eleanor touched her son's arm, a silent signal of trust, her faith in him as unshakable as it had been in her own unit decades ago. James nodded, his expression resolute, and turned to face the bikers. The soldiers adjusted their grips on their rifles, their movements subtle but deliberate, a silent warning to Razor and his crew. The streetlights cast long shadows across the square, the golden leaves of the sycamores rustling in the evening breeze as if the town itself held its breath. Eleanor's heart pounded, not with fear but with the certainty of justice. Her son was here, and with him the weight of the U.S. Army, a force Razor couldn't intimidate. The confrontation loomed, a clash of past and present, honor and disrespect, under the watchful eyes of Grayson Hollow. James Hayes strode across the square of Grayson Hollow with the measured confidence of a soldier on a mission, his two comrades following in lockstep, their boots echoing against the pavement in a rhythm that spoke of discipline and purpose. The streetlights cast their sodium glow over the scene, illuminating the golden leaves scattered across the ground, their edges curling in the crisp October air. The two Humvees loomed behind them, their green hulls a silent testament to the authority James carried, their engines cooling with faint ticks that punctuated the tense silence. Eleanor Hayes watched from her porch, her hands gripping the railing, her golden retriever Max sitting alert at her side, his ears twitching at every sound. The townsfolk lined the edges of the square, their faces a mix of awe and apprehension, Mr. Jenkins with his flower-dusted apron, Mrs. Carter clutching her toddler, and a dozen others who'd emerged from their homes, drawn by the spectacle unfolding on Main Street. The bikers, gathered near the diner, turned as James approached, their leather jackets creaking, the skull patches on their chests catching the light. Razor, the leader, dismounted his Harley, his scarred face twisting into a sneer, though a flicker of unease passed through his eyes as he took in the soldiers. His crew fanned out, their bravado faltering, their hands twitching near their belts. The air smelled of exhaust and tension, the faint scent of diner grease mingling with the earthy dampness of the evening. James stopped 10 feet from Razor, his broad shoulders squared, his uniform impeccable, the medals on his chest glinting with every breath. The soldiers flanked him, their rifles slung but ready, their faces impassive under their helmets. "You disrespected a veteran," James said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, deep and unyielding. "My mother. That ends now." Razor cracked his knuckles, his sneer widening, though his eyes darted to the Humvees. "She's just an old lady," he growled, his voice rough as gravel. "What you gonna do, soldier boy?" The bikers laughed, but it was forced, a hollow sound that died quickly in the heavy air. James signaled with a sharp gesture, and the soldiers moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. One grabbed Razor's arm, twisting it behind his back in a swift motion that made the biker grunt in pain, while the other two soldiers encircled the group, their movements a silent threat. The bikers resisted, shoving and shouting, their voices a chaotic jumble of curses and defiance. "Get off me," one yelled, a lanky man with a snake tattoo, swinging a fist that the soldier dodged with ease. Another, the wiry man with a goatee, tried to run, but a soldier tackled him to the ground, pinning him with a knee to his back. Eleanor watched, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and memory, her mind flashing to Vietnam, nights of chaos, the scream of mortars, the steady hands of her unit holding a perimeter. She'd seen conflict, had lived it, and now her son carried that legacy forward. The square erupted into a controlled chaos, bikers swung wildly, soldiers blocked and countered, their training evident in every move. James moved with purpose, his fist connecting with Razor's jaw in a sharp crack that silenced the biker's taunts. Razor staggered, blood trickling from his lip, but James didn't relent, grabbing him by the collar and forcing him to his knees. The soldiers subdued the others, their zip ties snapping into place with a sound that cut through the night. The townsfolk gasped, some filming with shaky hands as the dust settled, the bikers now a defeated heap on the ground. Eleanor's gray eyes gleamed with resolve, her nursing instincts urging her to tend wounds, but she stayed, a witness to justice. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The square of Grayson Hollow lay still under the glow of the streetlights, the golden leaves scattered across the pavement now trampled under the boots of soldiers and the defeated forms of the bikers. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of blood, a stark reminder of the brief but intense confrontation that had just unfolded. James Hayes stood at the center of the scene, his uniform still crisp despite the scuffle. His broad shoulders squared as he surveyed the bikers now kneeling before him, their wrists bound with zip ties. The two soldiers stood vigilant, their rifles slung but their hands ready, their faces impassive under the brims of their helmets. The Humvees loomed in the background, their green hulls a silent testament to the authority James wielded, their presence a comfort to the townsfolk who had gathered in a loose semicircle around the square, their whispers a soft hum in the evening air. Eleanor Hayes descended the steps of her porch, her movements slow but deliberate, her golden retriever Max trotting at her side, his tail low but his eyes alert. The absence of her cane made her steps cautious, but her posture was one of unyielding strength, a veteran who'd faced worse than a gang of bikers. The townsfolk watched her with a mix of awe and gratitude. Mr. Jenkins, his apron still dusted with flour, nodded solemnly. Mrs. Carter, her toddler now asleep in her arms, offered a small smile, and young Tommy from the hardware store clutched his phone. the video he'd recorded already uploading to the internet. Eleanor's gray eyes swept over the scene, landing on Razor, the biker leader, whose scarred face was now marred with a fresh bruise, his lips split and bleeding from James's earlier strike. His crew, once loud and defiant, now knelt in silence, their heads bowed, the fight drained from them by the soldiers' swift efficiency. James turned to his mother, his dark eyes questioning, seeking her guidance as he had since he was a boy. Eleanor nodded, her voice low but firm, carrying the weight of decades of command. "Make them understand, James," she said, her tone steady, a nurse's calm in the face of chaos. James faced the bikers, his presence towering, his voice a deep rumble that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. "You'll pay for damages, my mother's cane, the town's peace," he said, his words deliberate, each one a hammer strike. "And you'll apologize publicly right now." Razor glared, his jaw tight, but a soldier's grip on his shoulder tightened, forcing a grunt of pain from his lips. He relented, his voice gruff and reluctant. "Sorry, ma'am," he muttered, his eyes avoiding Eleanor's. "For the cane," the words. The other bikers followed, their apologies halting but audible, a chorus of regret that felt forced but necessary. James outlined their punishment with the precision of a military briefing: community service to repair the damage they'd caused in town, a fine to cover the cost of Eleanor's cane and the library's defaced wall, and a formal ban from ever returning to Grayson Hollow. The soldiers moved with efficiency, loading the bikers into the second Humvee, their engines roaring to life with a deep growl that echoed through the square. Eleanor watched, her chest swelling with pride, the sting of the cane's loss fading in the face of justice served. The townsfolk erupted into applause, their fear replaced by gratitude, their voices a chorus of support for the woman who'd stood firm against intimidation. Eleanor touched the medals hidden beneath her sweater, a silent vow fulfilled, her legacy of courage passed to her son. The night deepened, the Humvee's taillights fading into the distance, leaving Grayson Hollow quieter than before, the golden leaves still under the streetlights, a symbol of a town reborn. The morning after the confrontation in Grayson Hollow dawned with a golden clarity, the October sun rising over the rolling hills and casting a warm glow across the town. Main Street was quiet, the sycamores lining the lane shedding their golden leaves in a gentle cascade, their branches swaying in a soft breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Eleanor Hayes stood on her porch, a new cane in her hand, a gift from the townsfolk, carved by Mr. Jenkins's nephew, a local craftsman, with her initials each etched into the handle in a delicate script. The cane was sturdy, its wood polished to a warm sheen, a symbol of the community's gratitude for her stand against the bikers. Max, her golden retriever, lay at her feet, his tail wagging lazily, his eyes bright with the calm of a new day. Eleanor wore her gray sweater, the same one from the day before, but beneath it, she'd pinned her purple heart medal, its purple ribbon catching the light, a quiet tribute to her past. The two Humvees returned to the square at 9 a.m., their engines a low rumble as they parked with precision near the diner. James Hayes stepped out, his uniform still crisp, his medals gleaming, his broad shoulders squared with the authority of a captain who'd seen combat and command. The soldiers followed, their movements synchronized, their rifles slung as they escorted the bikers from the second Humvee. Razor and his crew looked diminished in the morning light, their leather jackets scuffed, their faces sullen with the weight of their defeat. The townsfolk gathered once more, their numbers larger now, a crowd of 50 or more lining the square, their faces a mix of curiosity and resolve. Mr. Jenkins stood with his arms crossed, Mrs. Carter held her toddler, and young Tommy from the hardware store waved a small American flag, his video from the previous night now viral, bringing attention to Grayson Hollow's stand. James oversaw the scene with a soldier's precision, his dark eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the bikers. Eleanor descended the porch steps, her new cane tapping a steady rhythm, Max trotting at her side. She stood beside her son, her small frame radiating a quiet strength that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. Razor stepped forward under James's stern gaze, his scarred face bruised, his lips still swollen from the night before. His voice was gruff, the words forced but clear. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, meeting Eleanor's eyes for the first time. "For the cane, for the words, for disrespecting you." It won't happen again. The other bikers echoed him, their apologies halting but sincere, a collective acknowledgement of their wrong. James nodded, his expression unyielding, and the soldiers handed Razor a document, a formal agreement outlining their restitution, a fine, community service, and a ban from Grayson Hollow, signed under military supervision. The soldiers released the bikers, who mounted their Harleys with heads low, their engines a subdued hum as they rode out of town, the sound fading into the distance. The townsfolk erupted into applause, their voices a chorus of gratitude, their hands clapping in rhythm as Eleanor raised her new cane in acknowledgement. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his pride evident in the slight smile that softened his stern features. The crowd dispersed, some approaching Eleanor to offer thanks, others planning a community event to celebrate the town's resilience. Eleanor returned to her bungalow, Max at her heels, and sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea, the new cane across her lap. That night, James called from Fort Bragg, his voice a comfort over the line, promising to visit soon. Eleanor smiled, her thoughts drifting to Vietnam, to Sergeant Daniels, to the legacy of courage she'd passed to her son. The stars above Grayson Hollow shone brightly, a testament to a town renewed, a veteran honored, and a lesson taught, one that would not be forgotten.